Oh man. All right. So, hello everyone. I'm back from a mission out of the country into an area in Europe that is known for its sacred wells, its healing springs, its wonderful bodies of water that will invariably kill you because everyone is said to have both, a healing saint that patrons it or a fairy or a kelpie who will just kill you if you go near it.
Yay,
So,
Scotland!
Scotland forever!
Welcome back. You're usually the one doing the editing for the episodes. I was doing it last time for Dryberg. I'm very glad that you enjoyed the little vine boom sound effect that we put in.
yeah, I was listening to that after the fact once it had gone live, and I was like, "Oh my God, Svinga,
Yeah, well, it happened, and
yeah."
and unfortunately, you're back. We recorded that early before you left for Scotland,
Mhm.
and then now, unfortunately, Salt's away. And he was even saying, like, I didn't even say much in the Dryberg episode because there wasn't much to say. I was just flabbergasted about what was going on. But he'll be back and in full force next time. So he's on a mission. You were on a mission. Now it's just me and you. And today's topic is St. Guinefort.
Absolutely, the enigmatic dog saint, non-human, added to the litany of other inanimate or non-human things that have become saints over the years, but unique in his place as a dog.
Mm-hmm.
Very near and dear arcana to both of our hearts.
Yeah, and that's, it's a shame that Salt can't be here for this one because in our little picture for the podcast, I'm the dragon, he's the owl, and Salt's the wolf. And all three of us have a bunch of dog and wolf stuff going on completely independently of each other as well as together. So I know he has a lot to say, which is why we're doing a werewolf episode within the next, surely like 10, I would imagine. We have quite a
Oh
few that
yeah.
are pre-scheduled, but like werewolves, it will be like a multi-part thing because we're all big St. Christopher people. We have a bunch of other saints that are less associated with wolves and dogs in the West, but are hugely associated as such in Eastern Europe that I've introduced you guys to. So
Mhm.
there's a lot to talk about. But today it's Guinefort. And I'm really glad that we're starting off with Guinefort because I think that this is such a great way to really talk about the notion of a saint, like how things become sainted, like what is a folk saint, is it just the
Mhm.
acknowledgement of the church that, renders something folk or not? I read this wonderful article about, saints and sainthood in various aspects of South America. So not just Mexico, but also, Guatemala and Brazil and plenty of other places that was talking about, how a image of a saint is a saint and not just like an icon, but like a literal image of it, or like the thing that the saint touches is the saint, whatever
Right.
something that you place on its shrine is the saint, the prayer is the saint, the amparo is the saint, any talisman by virtue of having passed through the saint's purview is the saint. And I think that Guinefort's story, as well as all the different kinds of stories that follow in the folkloric templates of, the dog and the serpent and the child and, the way that those roles get reversed sometimes, is a great story of like the mythopoetic power of sainthood and the way it's conveyed.
Absolutely, yeah. That's an adage that I've always loved out of, Mexico and Central and South America as a whole, where that which is a saint is that which works, that which can affect miracles.
Mm-hmm.
So, you can, of course, bring about miracles using talismans and amparos and all of these, tapayos and things that have touched the saint, that incorporate their mythos, their hagiography, their historiola, their relics, etc.
Yeah, it's also like the way that, oils, for example, in Orthodox magic, or at least the parts of, Eastern Orthodox magic that I'm privy to, are the very oil that was in the lamp that you've been cultivating for the saint from your grandmother for years, for generations. It's been the same oil lamp,
Mhm.
just replenished in front of that same icon. And like there's something else added to it, that is the oil of Saint Marina of Antioch, is because you've been literally praying to her at that shrine for so long. And yes, you can flavor it, you can add things, or you can get a little bit of that oil, just like a tiny pinch of it, and you add
Right.
it to regular olive oil. and it's undetectable, imperceivable to taste. And that gets strained and added to things, and it gets strained again. And the whole point is that it should not look different from anything else. It gets stored in an ordinary olive oil bottle because, if you're using it to, let's say, juju your husband or something like that, or if you're using it to kind of calm your kids down, the typical things that you see these saints being invoked for, they're not supposed to notice that their cooking is different when they eat the food that you put all the stuff in.
Exactly.
And there's something about that with Guinefort and these kind of unlikely folk saints, being not so unlikely if you get a better grasp on what is an incredibly broad notion of holiness, and an even more broad and diverse notion of what it is to be, in communion with God and acting out his power and being a vessel for it and a recipient of it, of allowing his grace to move through not just a particular vessel, as in a person or even a canine, but through a situation, through a story, through as you pointed out history earlier, that gets played out in a certain way. And what that means for people who are looking to pray not just to a saint, but to pray like a saint, to get closer to God by praying to him in the ways that, the saint that they're emulating would.
Definitely, yeah. I think it's, a very beautiful notion where any vehicle that can become the vehicle, to be concise about it, is used.
Yeah, exactly.
Not to lift the, explicit transliteration of like Vajrayana, but
no, it's
expedient vehicle to reach the final point, as you said, to pray like the saint, to become saintly yourself, and to sanctify all that you do through the sanctity of that which you are petitioning, to emulate, in magic as a whole, one of the most central doctrines is like will bring about like. So you act in a saintly way that could bring about the saint, to emulate their legend,
And sorry, I'm just so excited to jump in on this because, like, one of a major exercise one of my spirits passed on to me that I passed on to you and a few of our friends are doing is like, ask each familiar in your court, ask each of your your spirits that follow you and that assist you, who do you pray to? You would be shocked by the answers some of them give. You've had situations where very like a nymph from Hecate says it's the Virgin Mary that she prays to, or it's like a spirit from a completely very set kind of arcana in your mind. It turns out that they're praying to a completely different conception of the divine. One spirit that I remember this very fondly, that who is also very plugged into various Christian mysteries. He was praying to the rocks and the stones and the rivers. The last thing that he prayed to was the river that he drank from. And he considered that very almost like pantheistically. It was like the form of God. This kind of sanctified sacramental theology, of God eternally coexisting and, co-arising through nature, as like the book of nature is like a kind of second scripture that is revealed only through this world. Lots of great things to read there from like not just Saint Francis of Assisi, but just like a lot of the Romantic poets, as well as a lot of the ways that people have kind of struggled against modernity and its conditions of identity and selfhood, and this reified understanding of a strong divide between a nature that is inert or that is there for us to use, as opposed to one that we are in some ways custodians of, or one that we are subjects of and at the mercy of, and ones in which, like in Christian theology specifically, thinking of ways in which nature might be a way for God's will to be revealed. That becomes really important for a lot of these, the sanctification of God being present in all things and co-arising concurrently with them, like bees making churches and steeples out of their honey, or covering icons and so on, and praying and so on and so forth, being linked to angels, who likewise without the same kind of agency, eternally praise God. Anyway, I think it's beautiful. I think Guinefort is a great saint. I think there's an infinite source for supplications. So let's get to the music. And speaking of music, special thing this time.
Yeah, we received a cover of Hermenelig, our intro music, from a fan of the show and friend of ours in real life, Sunny K, important person in our lives, and we are so beyond appreciative of having this gift.
Yeah, I am incredibly touched, honestly, that she sent this in. She's been a huge supporter of the show and a great friend to us. And, on Instagram as well as in our Patreon Q&As, we've had people ask, what is that funky little tune? And it is indeed Hermana League. None other than, our favorite little hymn about a troll propositioning marriage, to our a Christian boy who says, nope, you're not Christian, but it is great. And it is actually a Yamaha Genos keyboard performance by Julius H. on Pixabay. So it was a royalty-free music from him. We're really grateful for it because it's a great little podcast tune. And we love a good spirit lover story, which Herman League is great for.
Yeah.
Just a little, what can you say? Notice is that she actually does not speak Swedish, but pronounced it beautifully. So here it is. Enjoy a cover of Herman League from Sunny K.
Solen operan innan fåglarna började sjunga. Bergatalet freder till fagerungers vän. Hon hade en falskaliger tunga. Hermana lik trollofen i mig. Värdet jag bjuder så gärna. I kunden väl svara endast ja eller nej. Om I viljen eller ej.
Be not alarmed at the frightful howls you may hear. It is Biki and Svinga
Yo.
here today. Salt is on a super secret mission out in the world, going about his exorcistic and itinerant priestly duties, and could not join us today, unfortunately, but has granted his blessing to Svinga and I to record the episode today.
Indeed, we miss him greatly, but he'll be back with a vengeance for the next one. And what is your B today, by the way?
Today's B is the braying of hounds. It's
a nice little break after all the romance of the last episode.
Oh yeah, that it is. The various, sultry bees that I loaded into that episode, gentlemen.
Yeah, we got quite a few. We have quite a few flustered messages about that. Oh God. Well, today we're holy and pure because we're talking about Saint Guinefort. No more brat taming. No more. No more
BDSM key.
Yeah, no more bondage. Emphasis on the B key. Yeah. Today it's just dogs.
What the dog doing?
And a holy dog, indeed. And what was he up to? So Saint Guinefort, actually, do you remember in the Toad Bone I asked, how did you guys come across him? I very distinctly remember how I first came across Guinefort. It's because I was getting all into Hermanubis. Salt actually is a big Anubis Guinepu, person. He very much worships that deity, and we have a fairly elaborate cultivated shrine to him in our house. And I got really into Hermanubis as well as Anubis, and I was reading Myths of the Dog Man by David Gordon White, and I was loving it, going through all the kinds of myths of Saint Christopher, everything. I'm always, like I said, hugely into Master of the Wolves, hugely into cynocephalic saints and everything like that. My dad actually wanted to take me to a monastery in Serbia that has a dog-headed Christopher, specifically for this reason, because we were talking about, how great all those icons are. Mm-hmm. And of course, we get into Guinefort there, and I had never heard of him. I do speak French, or not super well, but I do speak it. I understand a lot more than I can speak. It's nowhere near as good as my German or my Portuguese at this point. But, I was having a good time researching him. And then after you and I, met and started talking, I realized just how much you were into Saint Guinefort for a completely different reason.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So on the earlier note, before we even met, I had a pretty robust Christopher practice going on one of my favorite sorceress saints out there, cynocephalic, exorcist, werewolf, pseudo
Nephilim.
deity. Oh yeah, Nephilim giant who was explicitly a devil worshiper at various points in his life, a psychopomp, a Goez by many accounts in the original Greek of his hagiography that actually report that he was doing, exorcistic and necromantic magic in his lifetime, all sorts of beautiful things. So I was like, I like this guy.
Oh yeah. What's up to
But
like? He's great. And I think that how like people who get really into certain kinds of like deities or saint practices start accumulating everything about that. I find out with the cynocephalic saints, and we'll get into that later on in this episode where we go on down the list, like they just
right.
accumulate each other. Like if you start with one of them, suddenly you're like, whoa, why is Lazarus here? Whoa, why is Blaze here?
Exactly. They
Mhm.
definitely operate as a pact,
Mhm.
as many witchcraft accounts at trials where various werewolves will operate, in the service of God, be like me and my homies, and also this list of dog-headed saints who happen to be werewolves go out and hunt demons and exorcise the village every year, which I'm sure we'll get into at some point in this episode. But it's to perpetuate the tradition that there are indeed, a pack of hounds that serve various deities or the Abrahamic God himself, and they do indeed aggregate, which is how Guinefort came over this way, because not only are wolves a major thing for me, but dogs have become one as well. See the exorcism episode that we had for one of my encounters with various hellhounds that kind of paint a picture of what I get up to with those guys.
Oh my God, yeah, it's such a good story, and I'm really glad it was so in the beginning of the Exorcism in Antiquity episode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a fun time. One of the
Mhm.
spookier things I've ever done, but it was a good time.
Mhm. I think the count for like how many, dog and wolf skulls you need at this point exceeds my and Salt's like count together combined for like the amount of things that we
Yeah,
need to make. They like the various cauldrons and spirit fetishes and shrines we have to put up, as well as like decoys and sold vessels and so on. It's gonna be a lot. We're gonna be knocking on some taxidermist stores as soon as you move in, I think.
yeah, that we will be. In preparation for this episode, when we were talking about it, I did a count, and if I were to go through with the requests of all of the spirits and friends of spirits in my court who have asked for dog skulls and bones and things of this nature, it is a number greater than 10. Which, ouch to my wallet.
Why we ask the spirits to be like, you want yourself seated, you want yourself ensouled, you want your shrine all prettied up. Pay up, bring me the money first, and then we'll talk.
Exactly, right. Yeah, friendly reminder to all the listeners out there, you can say no to your spirits.
Yeah, and you can tell them to pay for their own things, give you new access to new avenues of money when they want, their statues upgraded and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's like, you want a dog skull, I want $200 to pay for a nice dog skull.
And what's funny is like some of the ones that I've looked into and that I purchased are way less than $200, $50, $40, and so on and so forth. But that's never the one that they quite want. Those are the ones that they want powdered and put into things. Like I remember,
yeah, right.
One of the main ones for the Master Wolves, mercifully, was not so expensive. It wasn't even 200 to be honest. But like it had to be a European wolf. He wouldn't, and I obviously live in Canada, so I don't live in Europe anymore. And I was like, but it's so much easier to get these, and also there's like all these different taxidermy import laws and and so on and so forth, treaties here. But I am very glad that it did come into my way, and it was huge, which is great because it needed to be big.
Absolutely, yeah. Was a very good find. Has found a wonderful home in your home that will soon be my home.
I know. Get over here soon.
Oh yeah.
Very soon this summer. So for this episode, I want to invite all of our listeners to check out this excellent book published by Cambridge University Press by Jean-Claude Schmitt, The Holy Greyhound, Guinefort, Healer of Children Since the 13th Century. This is not only an excellent and incredibly comprehensive scholarly study on the Guinefort legend, it also looks into comparisons with other ones, other folk tales of similar motifs, as well as just an actually really like deep and erudite examination of this myth, where it comes from, and where it was preserved in which locations, for example, in France as well as outside of it. The core of the analysis is a book written by a Dominican friar named Stephen of Bourbon, who had died in 1261. So the entire book, right, written by Schmidt, is based on an analysis of this text, because this is the first written record of the Guinefort myth. So Stephen of Bourbon spent the last years of his life writing a treatise in the Dominican Covenant at Lyon. And this work, which was written in Latin, was on the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. Now, he died without completing it, and the drafts essentially vanished from history until 1877, when the historian A. Lecoy de Lamache published a number of its extracts and successfully attributed it to Stephen of Bourbon. The treatise, which is essentially a theological commentary on the gifts of the Holy Spirit, largely consists of exempla. So these are anecdotes used by preachers in their sermons in order to edify the matter to the faithful. So Schmidt notes, for example, that there are essentially 3 categories of exempla in this work. So the first is those that come from the Bible or other ecclesiastical authors. The second is those from narratives collected by Stephen of Bourbon from reliable witnesses, being what they themselves witnessed and experienced. And sometimes, for example, this would duplicate written tradition, in which case the theory was seen as doubly authentic, because not only does it exist in writing and the tradition of sort of like, not just like scriptural analysis, but also in preaching, but also it actually happened to somebody, and it's a reliable witness. And then the final one is those from Stephen of Bourbon's own experiences. And this is actually the kind that our Guinefort story comes from. So that, this commentary on the gifts of the Holy Spirit is quite long. It includes lots of exempla, and there's one in particular that's about Guinefort. And this one tiny little story is the source, at least in the literary tradition, of almost all of the other ones. So we're going to read the entirety of Schmidt's translation of this text, which is on the worship of the dog Guinefort. It's not terribly long. It is a little bit longer, but it's not like huge, but merely summarizing it would not do it justice. And since it's just, you and me, we're gonna, alternate who reads the quotes. Usually it's a little bit easier when we have, Salt or just 3 people in general. But I'm gonna give this to you to read in your lovely baritone, and then we're gonna go through, we're gonna analyze it together, because I think this is incredible. It's a great text, and you can see just the infinite richness for the magic that is to come.
Sixthly, I should speak of offensive superstitions, some of which are offensive to God, others to our fellow men. Offensive to God are those which honor demons or other creatures as if they were divine. It is what idolatry does, and it is what the wretched women who cast lots do, who seek salvation by worshipping elder trees or making offerings to them, scorning churches and holy relics. They take their children to these elder trees or to anthills or to other things in order that a cure may be effected.
I'm sorry to pause you, but I just need to say, who out here, being a wretched woman, whomst casts lots? Who out here seeking salvation by worshiping elder trees and making offerings to them? See, this is a thing I'm gonna let you read the quote. I'm sorry, but this is what blows my mind about these things. It's so discovery of witchcraft. It's like, oh, these things are bad, and then just casually in writing records that there's all these diviners and people doing sortilege and various auguries and worship elder trees and make offerings to them instead of churches and holy relics. And they take their children to ant hills, and of course, ants being a very Saint Christopher animal. Actually, they hold the world upon their shoulders. As Christopher holds God, in the person of Jesus. And it's so good. We'll get into healing. I'm sorry, I'm obsessed with this part. When I started reading this, I was like, oh yeah, this is gonna be great.
You absolutely gotta love the documentation of folk and witchcraft traditions in the treatises that are written against them.
Literally, yes.
Thank you to them for facilitating the very practice of those folkloric and witchcraft traditions.
Yeah, and thereby people like Stephen of Bourbon becoming casual ancestors of the ink, the very people who recorded these things, joining the litanies of the pseudepigraphers and grimoire authors, because the spirits that patron writing, magical writing, they don't see a difference, right? It's all holy writing, because we're preserving these texts for generations to come. Okay, I'm getting too excited now. We'll analyze it in a second. Continue on.
This recently happened in the Diocese of Lyons, where, when I preached against the reading of oracles and was hearing confession, numerous women confessed had taken their children to a Saint Guinefort. As I thought that this was some holy person, I continued with my inquiry and finally learned that this was actually a greyhound, which had been killed in the following manner. In the Diocese of Lyons, near the enclosed nuns' village called Nivelles, on the estate of the Lord of Villiers, was a castle, the lord of which and his wife had a baby boy. One day, when the lord and lady had gone out of the house, and the nurse had done likewise, leaving the baby alone in the cradle, a huge serpent had entered the house and approached the cradle. Seeing this, the greyhound, which had remained behind, chased the serpent and, attacking it beneath the cradle, upset the cradle, bit the serpent all over, which defended itself, biting the dog equally severely. Finally, the dog killed it and threw it well away from the cradle. The cradle, the floor, the dog's mouth, and the head were all drenched in the serpent's blood. Although badly hurt by the serpent, the dog remained on guard beside the cradle. When the nurse came back and saw all this, she thought the dog had devoured the child and let out a scream of misery. Hearing it, the child's mother also ran up, looked, thought the same thing, and screamed too. Likewise, the knight, when he arrived, thought the same thing, drew his sword, and killed the dog.
So the women come in and they scream, and then he's like, okay, I would kill him.
I was going to say, it's a very Monty Python-esque chain of people where one enters, screams, the next enters, screams, the next enters, screams, and then the next enters, screams, and then does something about it.
Yeah, very Monty Python.
Then, when they went closer to the baby, they found it safe and sound, sleeping peacefully. Casting around for some explanation, they discovered the serpent torn to pieces by the dog's bites, and now dead. Realizing then the true facts of the matter, and deeply regretting having unjustly killed so useful a dog, they threw it in a well in front of the manor door, threw a great pile of stones atop it, and planted trees beside it in memory of the event. Now, by divine will, the manor was destroyed, and the estate, reduced to a desert, was abandoned by its inhabitants. But the peasants, hearing of the dog's conduct, and of how it had been killed, although innocent, and for a deed for which it might have expected praise, visited the place, honored the dog as a martyr, prayed to it when they were sick or in need of something, and many there fell victim to the enticements and illusions of the devil. Have you ever seen The Devil Boy? Who in this way used to lead men into error. Above all, though, it was women with sick or weak children who took them to this place. They would go and seek out an old woman in a fortified town, a league distant, and she taught them the rituals they should enact in order to make offerings to demons, and in order to invoke them, and she led them to the place. When they arrived, they would make offerings of salt and other things. They would hang their babies' swaddling clothes on the bushes round about. They would drive nails into the trees which had grown into this place. They would pass the naked babies between the trunks of 2 trees. The mother, on one side, held the baby and threw it 9 times to the old woman who was on the other side. Invoking the demons, they called upon the fauns of the forest of Remit to take the sick, feeble child, which, they said, was theirs, and return that child that the fauns had taken away, fat and well, safe and sound.
First of all, get me this old woman's phone number.
Yeah, right? Put your demon trafficking grandma on the phone.
Yeah, who's like, oh, your child is sick, very clearly a changeling. Let's throw it through the portal of fairies by St. Guinefort's shrine and give you back your real kid. Also, here's a bunch of phones.
Having done this, the infanticidal mothers took their children and laid them naked at the foot of the tree on straw from the cradle. Then, using the light they had brought with them, they lit the 2 candles, each an inch long, one on either side of the child's head, and fixed them in the trunk above it. They then withdrew until the candles had burnt out, so as not to see the child or hear him crying. Several people had told us that while the candles were burning like this, they burnt and killed several babies.
I don't think that Stephen of Bourbon found that particularly as funny as we did.
Oh, absolutely not. He was probably appalled, but thanks to him for documenting this.
Like, It's the writing style, honestly, that gets me. It's like look at how whack these people are, but also perfectly described lore, and then possible, polemically, influenced storytelling, possible exaggerations, possibly not. and then just casually, oh yeah, they were just like leaving these changeling babies that were afflicted by plague in here to just burn in these 1-inch long candles. Like I press X to doubt on his description of this, but also so it's one way to make witch ointment,
Yeah, right. The wax from the trees of St. Guinefort's Grove. That sounds pretty good to me. So to conclude the quote, one woman also told me that she had just invoked the fawns and was withdrawing from the scene when she saw a wolf come out from the forest toward the baby. If maternal love had not made her feel pity and go back to him, the wolf, or as she put it, the devil in the shape of the wolf, would have devoured the baby. When a mother returned to her child and found it still alive, she carried it out to the fast-flowing waters of a nearby river, called the Chalaronne, and plunged it 9 times. If it came through without dying on the spot or shortly thereafter, it had a very strong constitution. We went to this place. We called together all the people of the estate, and we preached against everything that had been said. We had the dead dog disinterred, and the sacred wood cut down and burnt, along with the remains of the dog. And I had an edict passed by the lords of the state, warning that anyone going henceforth to that place for any such reason would be liable to have his possessions seized and then sold.
Thank you for reading that for us. I am fixated on so much of this, but also especially the devil in the shape of a wolf. Incredible name for a band. Incredible name for a coven. Incredible name for you, me, and Salt's stuff that we get up to with the Master of Wolves.
Our Thursday nights.
Yeah, our Thursday nights. Yeah, phenomenal. As I said, just something really, Reginald Scott's discovery about the Saul, right? He's recording these beliefs and these heresies and these folk practices and preserving them in writing, and then you also have this phenomenal healing ritual, the notion of fairies and fauns, being invoked, the concern of changelings, in the 13th century as being, especially during plague, as like that's what's actually happening. A key thing I note is that he was physically present when the actual dog, Guinefort, was disinterred, right? Because they cut down the woods and, that, and the remains of the dog, they burned it, right? So this is a very important thing not to miss at the ending of this story, which is that Stephen of Bourbon literally was there. Like he went there, he heard the story, and he was appalled by what he had witnessed, and he felt that people were essentially, regressing into idolatry and paganism and magic and all these other things, and he demanded to put a stop to it. And he physically saw there were actual greyhound remains, right? So as much as you'll see soon, that there's many stories that take the exact same shape of the Guinefort one, the legends from, much older than Guinefort itself, that follow a very similar structure when it comes to understanding the kind of motifs of the fairy tale, if you will, is that there was an actual greyhound interred here. Like there was a dog that was sainted and was, killed unjustly, martyred, if you will, and it's really interesting because martyrdom, right, the witnesses, to the faith of Christ, they're martyred for God, right? So the question is like, what was a dog martyred for? And in a way, it seems that, yes, the baby, right? He wanted to protect the child, but he was also unjustly, persecuted despite acting on an incredibly benevolent nature, like this kind of almost divine will of like, as much as, we mentioned before with understanding in Christianity that you can have presence of the holiness of God, being revealed eternally and concurrently, his grace throughout nature, and so in this way we have here a potential manifestation of that, just like how bees can, make a little cathedral, a bee church, a birch, if you will, out of honey,
Bees make honey.
We also have a completely separate, situation, where of course a dog may be moved to behave in the grace of God to protect the innocent child, much in the way that, angels and saints do. Although, and then what happens after, we have this interaction is we have people, much to Stephen of Bourbon's chagrin, running with this story and doing all kinds of, devil worship in the woods, with a question mark over devil, with a question mark over, whatever's going on here, folk healing rituals, possible, examples of Christian magic, possible witchcraft, a shadowy cabal, in the center of the woods, of these fairies and satyrs and fauns, and, an old woman whose phone number I desperately need in order to understand.
Exactly.
Yeah, they've got a whole little gang there.
Shadow Wizard Money Gang. We love casting spells.
But yeah, there's something very beautiful about this, transcription of this exorcistic healing ritual that has been described, offering salt to the sacred grove and the fawns that live therein, passing the babe either through or around the tree 9 times, nailing the illness into the tree, as I'm sure we're both, familiar with 10 different takes on this particular technique.
I literally sent you one recently, right? Which is like the Serbian, like the Balkan elf shot one where you do it 9 times. Yes. Removing it with the lead, lead pouring. So leaving a strava for my fellow Balkan people.
I sent you the Scandinavian version of the same as well. Yes. Pinning onto the tree the effigy of the illness after passing around it 9 times at midnight on a Thursday. It's a whole thing,
We love it.
It's a very well-established and well-attested technique. And I'm, just enthralled every time that I see it replicated in text. Like
Across
you were saying earlier.
time, cultures, yeah.
Right. Like you were saying earlier, it doesn't matter, if it's grimoire or a polemic against, it's the sorcerer's techniques are still revealed all the same. And I think there's something very, beautiful about the saintliness of this and how directly it's tied to other saints. Of course, very Josephian in many ways of being able to nail illnesses to tree, cure illness of especially children, to protect the baby in the cradle, as not to oral charm pose, but as Joseph protected Jesus in the cradle, et cetera, et cetera. But also very Christophorian, including even the translation of the relics into hellfire and to burn the relics at martyrdom, to, call into parallel those dog saints at the end of their life. They're often burnt. Is something I've kind of noticed, or are burnt in different ways, as I'm sure we'll get into with the plague saints and the dog connection. Lazarus most completely aligned with this metaphor, and the burning of the buboes upon the skin.
Absolutely. And on a much less serious note, I'm really glad we finally found a way to sneak in Shadow Wizard Money Gang.
Oh yeah, we've been
thinking about it. Yeah,
hard.
We've been thinking about it for so long, and that even was originally an intro we wanted to do, but then we thought that would, it'd be a little bit much. But that is the name of many of our group chats, and and a Snapchat group, and a bunch of other things that we're on with some friends. And oh god, I'm so glad that we finally put it in there. And I wasn't even gonna do it in Guinefort. I was like, oh, there's gonna be another opportunity for it, surely. But as soon as the bees thing happened, I was like, okay, DJ Smokey, you're on.
Right. Like I was gonna think like, oh, if we do an episode on like the Solomonari and like Sholomance, surely Shadow Wizard Money Gang will find a way in there. But
we'll put it in there when you least expect it. Yeah.
We also got in Bees Make Honey.
Yeah, we had to do it. Yeah. Well, we'll see how many DJ Smokey, just bits we can put in over the next few episodes. But yes, oh, what a relief. I feel like I can finally breathe again, and we finally put it in. But
absolutely,
yeah. So I think I really recommend this work to anyone interested in Guinefort. Schmidt's book is really about tackling the tensions of this exact text, this tiny little thing that we read out for you just now. It's the tensions between literate, clerical, canonizing culture, right? And that of popular religion, folk culture, oral traditions. So he spent some time discussing and contextualizing who Stephen of Bourbon was. Who was he? What was his preaching like? What was his writing like? How did he join the Dominican order? And of course, the very nature of what constituted a superstition and a heresy in his time. And after outlining these primary considerations, Schmidt moves us into analysis of the legend. So the kind of evidence about folk culture and beliefs that this story presents to us comes via 2 streams within the text, right? The first being the origins of the cultic site and the legend of the dog, and then the second being a description of the healing ritual with the babies. It cannot be understated that Stephen came across Guinefort, like this account, while literally preaching against divination. Because as Schmidt notes, neither the peasants whose confession he heard, nor Stephen himself, had any doubts about the authenticity of the dog's death, the story of how it happened, the serpent, the baby, and not only was this, informed, by the beliefs of Stephen himself, but also his decision to suppress it. So in this story, right, in its skeleton, it appears in many other places. As we've mentioned a few times already, there is a more well-known trope indexed in the International Classification of Folklore as B524FF. There are a few different versions of this tale that mirror the structure. One source, being recorded by Pausanias in Greece at around 160 to 180 AD, is about a legend of a city being Amphiclea in focus. And we see a reverse of the Canaan and serpent role as follows.
A certain chief, suspecting that his enemies were plotting against his baby son, put the child in a vessel and hid him in that part of the land where he knew there would be most security. A wolf attacked the child, but a serpent coiled itself round the vessel and kept up a strict watch. When the child's father came, supposing that the serpent had proposed to attack the child, he threw his javelin, which killed the serpent and his son as well. Being informed by the shepherds that he had killed the benefactor and protector of his child, he made one common pyre for both the serpent and his son. Now they say that even today, the place resembles a burning pyre, maintaining that after this serpent, the city was called Ophitea. Very cool way to give a child serpent packs, by the way, just saying.
Kill him, unfortunately, like spear him with a javelin through the snake that protected him. Like the ghost, God, I want the dirt. Just continuing this trend on this podcast, or we just read about something cool and we're like, I want this dirt. God damn. But yeah, first of all, great, like I said, great way to give someone certain packs. Reminds me of how to create dragons and snakes in my culture's form of witchcraft, but also very Alexander, very serpent father, human mother, Alexander the Great, because we also have, this child essentially becoming the city's god protector, along with the serpent kind of like fused together. I need a dirt, and I need it yesterday. Making a mental note to myself to text some Greek friends about this. Well, we'll be there soon.
That will be. I'm like, I need the javelin. I want the
Longinus, the snake Jesus spear. Yeah.
I was gonna say this is Serpent Longinus, who's Longinus already having that type of deal going on, but double snaked up.
Double snaked up. Let's go.
Our listeners stay double snaked up.
That's me. It's like pointing at a meme of some Sigma male. That's literally me, and just replacing the faces with snakes.
Oh man, but yeah, speaking of staying double snaked up, an even older legend mirroring the Guinefort myth of the folklore type B524FF comes to us from the Panchatantra, a 6th century BC Sanskrit text, which Schmidt in the book summarizes for us as follows.
A son had just been born to a Brahman and his wife. On the same day, their female mongoose gave birth to a baby, which the Brahman's wife raised as her own. One day, the Brahmani had to go out and entrust the child to the Brahman. But he went out in his turn, leaving the child alone with the mongoose. Shortly afterwards, a black snake emerged from a hole and was about to attack the child when the mongoose saved him by killing the snake. When the mother returned, she saw the mongoose's blood-stained jaws, thought it had eaten her child, and killed it. But when she went into the room, she found the child safe and sound, and the body of the snake in pieces. She realized her mistake and was very much distressed. When the Brahmin returned, she upbraided him for going out despite what she had said, and held him responsible for the death of their mongoose son.
I love that.
Yeah,
the mongoose son is very cool.
Yeah, and this particular story was translated into Pahlavi, then Arabic, then Greek, Hebrew, finally Latin. But interestingly, a version of it did not appear in the West until several years after Stephen of Bourbon's death, meaning that the account of Guinefort cannot actually be related to these stories, right? So Schmidt is especially interested in tracing the possible literary tradition which might have permeated contemporary oral culture at this time in order to create the Guinefort legend, right? Because we know there was a physical greyhound buried, right? Because Stephen of Bourbon mentions it, right? As he exhumed it and burned the body. And then on the other hand, there was clearly some kind of oral culture around some similar story already existing. So, whether, the story kind of literally happened or something similar to it happened, and then it became kind of folded into this greater motif. But this is a major thing that, Schmidt spends the book analyzing. He devotes some portion of the book to outlining other French and Latin textual sources, as well as examining different characters, elements, and like literary logics and motifs of the stories. One part of his analysis that I found really interesting was that in one of the stories he tracks down, the snake is referred to as the Felon Satanas, so the wicked serpent Satan, drawing
That's
upon biblical motifs, right, from the book of Revelation, when the dragon, who is also called, the old serpent, and the devil and Satan is about to devour a newly born child while the mother flees to the wilderness. Saint Michael here intervenes with the help of his angels to throw the dragon down. Burial of the greyhound relates to the rites, beliefs, and oral folk traditions concerned with the worship of the dead, right? The burial that the greyhound receives is directly linked to the rituals that are given over the funerals of holy ancestors, and especially holy martyrs. Local holy healers would be given a very similar ceremony to the one that is described as being given to the dog.
Yeah, regarding the holy martyrs, it really reminds me of, first, second, and third century graves of the sainted dead who were promised a particular place in heaven for their martyrdom and their own concern of, the return of Christ within their lifetime or within their children's lifetime, where it would be, interred at already holy sites in massive stone cairns and things of this nature, and be buried where those in community can approach them in these sacred sites that are explicitly made for pilgrims to participate in that which is the saint, as we discussed at the very beginning of the episode, to pass the relics over the shrine to take the saint with them.
Yeah, and not to mention, as I'm sure everyone listening knows, the first saints were martyrs, right? There was no differentiation between a saint and a martyr. It was a witness to the death of Jesus, who in some ways leaped to his death by persecution to join the heaven's armies earlier, And so we have these understandings of like disturbing the saints, forcing them to become restless dead by constantly touching their bodies, not letting them have a peaceful interment. Their bodies are being manipulated, the oil in their lamps and their tombs is being drunk, and their relics are being taken. And all because it's understood there's a link to the holiness that they're experiencing and the holiness that is to come, because everyone's anxious, Jesus is coming back soon. It could be in our lifetime, if not our lifetime, in the lifetime of our children. And so there's this constant need to, there's this anxiety over how do we prove the baptismal seal is going to make us better people, hopefully. But, when you inevitably sin again, how do you maintain that seal? Confession arises as a kind of function to deal with this situation. But obviously some people are very anxious that the apocalypse could happen any moment. The second coming is literally coming, and so one way to escape that is in some ways just to become a martyr, because it sort of jettisons you into the future. And so some preachers begin to say, let's not do that, actually that's not a good idea, but at the same time it produces a tremendous array of holy figures, and many of their stories directly parallel each other. Saint Polycarp becomes a major motif whose story itself, in some ways imitatio Christi, imitates Christ in his death, even down to the spear wound with the blood extinguishing a fire that is not able to hurt him. And of course, our very own Saint Justina, her story definitely mirrors Saint Thecla. So we have these constant imitations of Christ in these deaths, as well as imitations of each other. And Guinefort here, his burial very much not only imitates, older legends, but they imitates, frankly, not just holiness and motifs of sainthood, but it imitates the Saint Michael that protects, the mother and child from the dragon in the book of Revelation.
Yeah, I think it's a very noble task that the author has gone on to try and trace back this, earlier motif and find how it fits in all these things, with the Guinefort pre-existing the dog legends existing in other parts of the world in the same martyrdom motif. But it's a Herculean task, simply as you described, this litany of diverse martyrs who all were martyred for different purposes and causes, also fitting very well onto this motif.
Exactly. And the abandonment and ruin of the castle could also be seen as happening through the will of God, right? A kind of divine punishment for the knight because of his crime against Saint Guinefort. And then the changeling baby healing ritual, I guess that's what I'm calling it, the CBHR. It occupies a lot of the further analysis. And I'm going to skip it just because I'm focusing on Guinefort here, but we'll definitely come back to it in a future episode referencing this exact text and these exact motifs, because we're going to look at changelings in one of the episodes for sure, and I want to, there's so much I have to say about that. We might even bring a guest on for it, but like this is particularly, it's important to flag, that it's not just Guinefort and his, healing cult. There's also this whole fairy changeling disease kind of dance going on in this forest as well. For now, let's take a quick survey into Guinefort the man, if you will, because there's also a veneration of a human Saint Guinefort, which has existed since at least the 11th century. The life, or vita, was composed sometime between the 8th and 12th centuries, and it comes to us to two different manuscripts, Passio Sancti Guineforti and the Miracula Sancti Guineforti, which is the miracles, So these are the accounts of his life and the account of his miracles, respectively. He is said to have lived at a time of the emperors Diocletian and Maximilian. Fleeing persecution, he left his native Ireland with his brother Guinebaldus and his two sisters. My brain kind of just stopped when I read that his brother's name was Guinebaldus, because I was, wait, you're telling me that his name is Guinefort, and then his brother is Guinebaldus, and they're the Guinea Bros. They're the super Guinea Bros. It's me, Guinebaldus.
This is a very brief aside, but shout out to that being the Irish legend of that, because the Irish origin of a lot of werewolf myths after Christianization is the result of the curse of various saints, notably Patrick, but Guinebaldus included.
Oh, I didn't know that. Thank you. It's exciting. It's striking. This is from Ireland, right? So the two sisters, by the way, that they're fleeing with, they're not mentioned in the Passio, but they are in the Miracula manuscript, where their names are Pusillanna and Favilla. And as they cross to Germany, they are martyred by the, quote, Teutonic tribes, and that their feast day as such is the 9th of January for the two sisters, right? But the brothers manage to evade them. And so they leave Germany, they enter present-day Italy, and they begin to preach there. But unfortunately for Guinebaldus, he is shortly arrested and beheaded by the local prince at Como. And at night, the Christians made off in secret with his body and they buried it. And his feast, so Guinebaldus' feast, is the 14th of October. Now, the only one remaining is Guinefort, and he continued to Milan alone, where he was also similarly arrested to be beheaded outside of town. His executioners stoned him, pierced him with arrows, very St. Sebastian, and they beat him with iron rods, though they didn't bother to behead him because apparently he was so pierced with arrows that he, quote, resembled a hedgehog. And they felt that there was no way he'd survive. But classic mistake, because everyone knows a martyr is invincible except for their head. Right? So he's all hedgehogged up, but he made it, So he falls to the ground and they believe that he was dead. But he managed to crawl all the way from Milan to Pavia, where this fleshy mass of arrows, where a Christian nursed him back to health and took him in. And here he just continues to cure numerous blind persons and lepers, and is finally buried in Pavia on his feast on August 22nd.
Shout out to whoever this random Christian is who was able to bring him back to health from being peppered with arrows, beaten by rods, being stoned, being tortured in all these other ways.
It was only a flesh wound. Speaking of the Monty Python-esque nature of some of these stories, it was literally only a flesh wound.
And one of the things that I want to highlight with this legend as well is how profoundly reminiscent it is of the martyrdom of St. Christopher, down to even the stoning in some versions of the hagiography, piercing with arrows, especially being beaten with iron rods, and surviving until beheading. As you mentioned.
And St. Sebastian, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Guinefort the man's. I just thought of Portugal the man. His cult, develops slowly, especially as he does not have a specialization that sets him apart from other saints, right? What is he the saint of? It's actually only in the 14th century that his veneration takes off and ascribes to him this kind of anti-plague capability. He came to be increasingly depicted as a knight, and he became associated with Saint Sebastian, like explicitly, right? Saint Christopher also explicitly, and another classic dog, Saint Roch, emphasizing their anti-plague capabilities together. And they became, literally invoked in the same liturgies. With a few generous donors and a couple of official adoptions by religious institutions, and eventually the granting of indulgences to the pilgrims of St. Guinefort by Pope Martin V, Guinefort the man's cult came to thrive in Pavia in the late medieval period as well as after. His body was dug up and transferred to the church of the Montesario Nuovo in the 17th century, with some of the relics being dispersed to strengthen his cult. While his cult nowadays is less prominent, he still enjoys a following, being especially invoked by those who are dying, who wish for a rapid and complete recovery, and especially against disease. Some later accounts exist of him being called upon to find marriage partners, interestingly, as well as for work if you're unemployed.
That's a very interesting function that we find across a lot of the dog saints that we've mentioned today and will subsequently mention, is later taking on patronage of finding marriage partners, especially for men to petition them, which is kind of fun. Mm-hmm. It just twigged my memory of an interesting account where there was a explicitly homosexual veneration of Saint Christopher in some areas, and I believe it was Germany, where certified bachelors, quote unquote, would call to him to find lovers.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
It's kind of a cool secondary function of a lot of these dogs. They got the dog in them.
What the dog doing?
Yeah. And I think at this point, right, we're going over Guinefort the man. I don't know what to say that every time, but I just do. And the question becomes, is his veneration and the veneration of Guinefort the dog the same? Because, of course, there's no reference to a dog in the story. He avoided being beheaded, whereas the dog was killed by a sword by being beheaded. But their cults have a lot in common. They both cure the sick, they both protect children, they both save people in situations of extreme danger, and they both arose roughly around the same time in the middle of the 13th century. While there is no observable relation, Schmidt says that it is worth clinging to the hypothesis that a relation by virtue of the same name does exist, especially given the geographical and historical diffusion of the cult of Pavia extending far beyond its reach in Italy with the distribution of relics. So Schmidt proposes a new typology, which takes into account the various different forms and functions of the Guinefort cults, while also transcending the distinctions between the two saints in the following three categories. The first is an official, clerical, even monastic form. So this entails the veneration of relics and the exaltation of a saint statue upon the occasion of his annual feast day. So the oldest instances at Pavia and Bourges are of this order for Guinefort the man. There's an intermediate form then, which is controlled by a member of clergy or by a hermit who would be attached to a country chapel. This sometimes contains a statue at which a folk rite will be performed, and there's also an annual pilgrimage that is sometimes held on a fixed day. And this form is most heavily documented for Guinefort in the 17th and 18th centuries. Next, and finally, we have the folkloric form, which rules out clerical control, but does not rule out references to Christianity, rather, right? So you still have Christian symbols, which would be present, such as the cross, even when the saint in question was a dog. You'd have relics, chapels, statues, fixed feast days. All these things are not included anymore. Instead, the framework of this veneration would be in nature, whether in wooded or aquatic scenarios. It's out in nature that these quote unquote new relics are found. And we know these accounts thanks to folklorists and anthropologists of the 19th and 20th centuries, with the only earlier account really being Stephen of Bourbon's 13th century exemplum. When talking about Stephen of Bourbon, his attempt to repress this cult, there's actually a really interesting quote from Schmidt. I'll have Key read an example, just a little excerpt here of a fuller quote that appears in his book.
Stephen of Bourbon had hoped, by repressing the cult of St. Guinefort, the dog and the martyr on the banks of the Chalaronne, to prevent the pilgrimage from ever being revived. The dog's bones were, of course, burned, as was the wood in the grove, and the peasants were threatened with the confiscation of their goods if they relapsed into the cult. The cult would seem to have been definitively destroyed, yet this pilgrimage seems to have been in existence since 1826. We learned this from another cleric, and for all the centuries that had passed, his language was remarkably similar to that of Stephen of Bourbon.
This is really remarkable, right? Is because we just talked about how, yes, we have these folklorist anthropologists of the 19th and 20th centuries noticing that almost identical veneration still exists. And then the only earlier account in text form, at least, was this 13th century exemplum, right? But nevertheless, we have a remarkable continuity between them. Regardless of how much time has passed, you can see how tenacious this folk oral tradition has. The account itself comes to us from a letter sent by the cure of the Châtillon-sur-Chalon in answer to a questionnaire about existing superstitions at each parish issued out by the new Bishop of Belley, Monsignor Devy. So in the letter, he's asking, he said that the survey, right, like the Monsignor, asking, like, what are the current superstitions in your parish, right? And the cure responds by saying, there is a mendicant who has taken up residence in a wood not far from Châtillon. The cure believes that this guy is only there because he wants to exploit the existing superstitions and to, quote, use the pretext of a religion he barely understands in order to obtain alms, end quote. And the account is as follows.
He claims to have discovered a saint in Thai wood, and that he knows the site where he is buried. I very much doubt this, unless he means some stone statue or other. He has assembled some fragments of little wooden or stone statues, which he has placed in a little chapel, which he has decorated as best that he can with foliage, and it is there that a fair number of people go in order to give him things. People have long been visiting this wood in honor of St. Guinefort. Mothers with ailing children come from far and near. Those with a fever come too, and tie or knot a little branch from a tree, and claim thus to knot the fever. This, Monsignor, is all I know of the subject.
This letter was clearly written without any awareness of Stephen of Bourbon's exemplum, right? The river Chardon in the original story has now become the wood of St. Guinefort, which is just a few dozen meters away from Chardon, evidencing a remarkable continuity of veneration, right? I love that you have this, he is clearly looking down at this person. He says this guy's obviously a charlatan who's trying to use the pretext of a religion he barely understands in order to attain money. But he looks to me, in this story at least, to be some kind of cunning person, some kind of folk healer who comes in there and knowing that it's a sacred site, knowing that it is for the honor of St. Guinefort, and, erecting his little, frankly, awesome, cool little, like, stone statue, animist, like, primitivist, like, chapel. Like, it sounds like some stuff that, like, I did with my best friend in, like, grade school, where we would, like, set up these little, like, almost Princess Mononoke type shrines around the forest near our school, and we would just try and talk to the spirits there. Like, we were always weird, we met when we were 9, like, this was always happening. And the knotting the fever charm, using the wood itself, where, maybe the very woods in which those mothers passed their babies, through the gap with the grandma whose phone number I still need, by the way. I need to ask her about her changeling magic. What were you trying to do with those babies and those candles? What ointments were you making? It's remarkable. So it just goes to show we're not even at the part where Stephen of Bourbon's exemplum is attributed to him in scholarship. It's still just out there somewhere, not yet translated. And we have this story coming through that evidences this incredible continuity of the tradition.
Right. I was going to comment upon the third example that was given of the form of veneration, that Schmidt proposed in his typology, where it's maintaining the symbolism of the Christian church, having this little churchyard and doing all these things and maybe having some crosses around with, a relic, a statue, a chapel, fixed feast days. But he has his, woodland church, and it regressed to, or rather advanced by regressing to the form that the cult originally existed, where it identifies the saint as that which is able to effect miracles. Exactly.
And there's other stories from 1879 and onward which do exist, and they're localized still around the same wood, but the Chardon. Exact replicas of a greyhound saint who protected a child from a snake and thereby became the protector of all children when he was murdered. Many polemics, as I'm sure you can imagine, arose out of this in an attempt to defend the practices by emphasizing that, St. Guinefort is a saint, not a dog, and that the mix-up occurred by homonym, right? It's just because there was this other guy who was also Guinefort, and because the dog's name was also Guinefort, this is how it became conflated. However, historians, folklorists, and even theologians alike, in examining these records, ultimately all agree that actually Guinefort was first a dog before he ever became a saint in this particular part of France. Baron Raverat in 1886 even notes at this conclusion explicitly, right? He says, actually, the elements of the Guinefort story, the dog, the snake, the witch, the immersion in the stream, etc., are proof of an even older tradition, one which he thinks actually is more harkening back to the Gaulish ancestry of the land. So interestingly, as much as many polemics might try to be embarrassed about this and be like, no, this was just like, silly rural people conflating a real saint with a dog by homonym. Even the very theologians that are examining this ultimately agree, no, there is historical evidence. There was originally a dog. Something like this did happen. And it did, however it became suffused into this myth, there was originally a dog. And, we know this from Stephen of Bourbon himself, right? He literally dug it up and burned the body.
I think there is, as the Beren Ravrat identifies, ultimately the important part, he harkens back to the Gaulish ancestry, but there is a functional cult center here that is able to produce results and do all these things,
Literally, yeah.
And that is, however the institutions that are in charge at the time, be it the aristocracy, be it the church, be it the local governance that is ruled by the church, doesn't particularly matter because people are still doing this thing.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, one last point to take from Schmidt's book before we move on to other things, just because this book is great and I had to cut through a lot of it, obviously, because I want to kind of hone in on just the parts for this episode that I needed. But he actually places Guinefort into the very line of dog-headed saints that you and I were just talking about that in the beginning, right? Saint Christopher, famously dog-headed, right? Celebrated on the 9th of May in the Byzantine Church and on 25th of July in the medieval Christian Church. It was on this later date that the Coptic Church celebrated Saint Mercury, who is also related to the setting of Sirius, the dog days of summer, which in the Balkans are called the Kresovi, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, the fires, and the celebration of Anubis in Egypt in May, as well as the related Guinefontes, the massacres of dogs ceremonies in Greece that take place on the 25th of July. The dog days, of course, begin on the 25th of July and end on the 24th of August, when Sirius sets once more in Canis Major. This is also right by the feast of Guinefort and Pavia, the saint that we mentioned, who was pierced by arrows and was invoked against the plague. And similarly, he's associated, as we mentioned before, in the litanies with Saint Christopher and Saint Roch. If we consider the widest possible range of the dog days, from the 2nd or 7th of May in the first setting to the 24th of August in the second, the list of dog-headed saints included in this astrological timing include the following. So we mentioned who some of them are, but you'd be surprised by how many of them actually exist in this range. The 22nd of May, we have Saint Guitterie or Guitteria, invoked in Spain and Gascony against rabid dogs.
One of my favorites.
Indeed. On the 15th of June, we have Saint Guy or Vitus, invoked against epilepsy, such as the Saint Vitus's dance and bites against dogs, wolves, and snakes. Hugely important to Balkan saint. We celebrate him on the 28th of June, actually, when the Pleiades come back in the sky. There's a whole period of time between May 6th, which is Slavic Orthodox St. George, all the way through St. Vitus of Vidovdan on 28th of June, an incredibly famous day where all the important things ever happened in kind of like a lot of Balkan history. But anyway, I digress. This is not about the Balkans. I will zip my lips for now. But just to say, Vitus, incredibly important saint of seeing, of curing, of diseases, of epilepsy, and also of the psychic sight, because his name, Vetus, Vid, is sight. The 4th of July is St. Ulrich, who offered protection against the bite of rabid dogs. 25th of July, we just mentioned St. Christopher, right? The 4th of August is St. Dominic. Very, ironic for, Stephen of Bourbon, but St. Dominic was the founder of the Dominican order. And thanks to the pun that his name inspired, Dominicanus, the dogs of the Lord, he came himself to be associated with a dog. Speaking of homonyms, and especially with Sirius, the star itself, because of the nature of his birth. His mother had visions and saw him as a dog crowned with the torch of the star Sirius. She's pregnant with him. So there you go, Mm-hmm.
Very cool, very Luciferian, if I may. I like that a lot.
Yeah, very Luciferian, very witchy, very, crowned with the dog star that, heralds even the flooding of the Nile, amazing. The 16th of August is Saint Roch, who offers protection against the plague and was bred by a hunting dog whose master converted to Christianity upon discovering him. And 20th of August is Saint Bernard, speaking of Dogs.
Oh,
Saint
hell yeah.
Bernard of Clairvaux, whom his mother saw before his birth in a dream in the form of a dog, and that's how we get Saint Bernards. Quite a litany of saints. For those of you into dog magic, this is like the ideal time to do all the cool stuff. Not just because of the sort of stellar magics of Sirius and the witchcraft associated with Sirius, specifically as a star, and of Canis Major, but especially because you have a litany of these amazing saints who are all associated with the dog-headedness, being a dog, being followed by dogs, curing illnesses. And interesting to note, while this is not our werewolf episode, we will have like 20 of those, I'm sure, analyzing every single cultural permutation that we're particularly interested in, which is all of them, I'm sure, all of the ones that we can find, at least. Important to note that a common motif for werewolfism is skin disease, right? It's having some form of disfiguration or some kind of skin irritation disease that is in some ways a marker of the curse or the blessing of the werewolf skin.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Just a brief digression, a very, very busy time of year for me, being a dog magic enjoyer, if you will, of, having this litany of saints, the Pleiades, being forced to transform into, wolves, dogs, things like that, being made to hunt, go out and, observe these rising and settings at these times, and, hunting, and of course the wild hunt being said to run on literally every one of these feast days, plus many more within this period.
Legit, yeah.
And yeah, exactly as you mentioned, skin conditions being the major marker, and of course, going into Lazarus, as I'm sure we'll mention eventually, also being found within this time period. Lazarus of the parable on the 21st of June, firmly falling within the heliacal rising and setting of Sirius.
You bet. Yeah, there you have it. Good. Thank you for catching that. I forgot to add them in. And we have a few different stories as well. You brought my attention to some, if you wanted to go into that.
We, of course, of the Arne Thompson type 178A, we begin with Guinefort himself and the legend that we have just spent the last, hour or so discussing. We then go into the Alpine Ligurian poem Sacrifici der Can, which tells of how a shepherd shot his sheepdog after finding it covered in the blood of one of his sheeps, only to find later a dead wolf in the stable. In India, as we referenced earlier with the particular tantras, a black snake replaces the wolf and a mongoose replaces the dog. In Egypt, as we have invoked many times, the story goes that a cook nearly killed a wali for having smashed a pot of herbs, but later discovered that the pot contained a poisonous snake. In Malaysian folklore, we find a similar story involving a tamed bear that was kept by a Malay hunter as a sort of guardian animal of his young daughter.
Holy shit. I want one. Like, why didn't my dad do that for me?
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Why give them, a teddy bear that you juju to have the spirit when you can give them an actual physical bear?
Yeah, I mean, when I have kids soon, we're Salt's already telling me about all the like teddy bear juju we'll do, and like little kamiyas will draw on their lunch boxes and things, but like that. This is a good idea, okay? Like,
oh yeah,
what could go wrong? Well, let's see what goes wrong.
Yeah, so what goes wrong is the hunter returns home from an expedition, finds the daughter missing, and the bear hanging out where the daughter once was, smeared in blood.
Oh dear, yeah. So typical story.
Typical story of the Arne Thompson type 178. So, rapidly thinking the bear devoured his daughter, the hunter kills it immediately with the spear, but finds the body of a tiger. Shout out to the Were Tiger episode. Go check that out.
Yes.
That was killed by the bear in defense of the daughter. And the daughter shortly emerges from the jungle where she had hidden from the tiger and taken refuge. Very cool and very folkloric fight, between
really cool
were tiger and a bear.
Always the spear, right? This is how this ends. And one time, piercing both sun and snake. Yeah, there is thank you for doing the ASMR voice every time you reference the previous episode, by the way.
Yeah, I gotta sell our discography,
Yeah, absolutely.
The last story of this type that I want to reference is one that particularly caught my interest because it is a very beautiful inversion, but also borrowing of the Guinefort legend, which is that of the Welsh Saint Gilair, where instead of a snake, a wolf is killed. But the interesting thing about Gilair is he is not a dog who becomes a saint, but instead a saint who becomes a dog. So Saint Gilair, or sometimes better known as Saint Keller or Saint Celer, was a mid 7th century hermit, healer, and alleged martyr. There's some difficulty that arises from later scholarship that disputes his particular martyrdom, but we'll get there. So this Saint Keller lived in caves and woods and specifically sacred groves throughout Wales, but eventually settled on a particular grove that had a sacred stone or lech that were both known to have miraculous healing properties.
It was said to be visited by such a concourse of people that no fair in Wales can equal it in multitude. It was reportedly visited by the infirm in summer, and particularly from St. Lazarus of the Parables feast on the 21st of June to St. Peter's feast on the 29th of June. After bathing, people are said to have lain down in a lech located at the churchyard, and if they could sleep, they were certain to be cured. At the same time, local people reportedly remembered seeing the crutches of some infirm persons left behind in the church, in memory of their having been cured by bathing in this well.
So one of the fun things about this well, and for our patrons, I will link the website in our show notes so you may visit. It is still one of the largest and best preserved holy wells in all of Cornwall. And one of the fun things is that the current keeper of this well and the church that was erected on the site, they hardcore observe the Wiccan Wheel of the Year, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
And do these beautiful, massive offerings and bouquets that garner this church at the time, and specifically are offered to the well to preserve its healing properties, which very cool.
That is super cool. Like, I don't know, like there's something about that. I hope we can visit it next time we go to Cornwall, actually.
Definitely, yeah. There's something that really reminds me of, the kind of the basal state of veneration that was previously identified, the third folkloric form that Schmidt highlighted in the typology, where the cult, as it becomes, Christianized, polemics are issued against the particular form of veneration, and then it kind of reverts to this basal animistic state.
Mm-hmm.
That retains the Christian imagery because, of course, the church in Cornwall is still a church. It still has the cross. It still has the altar upon which the offers are made, But it kind of perpetuates in the present day this folkloric motif that we've seen, which I think is really cool and just kind of goes to show the uniquely uninterrupted nature of this particular veneration of, all these dog saints.
So how did this guy become a dog?
He became a dog by the popularity and influence of the legend of Saint Guinefort. So around 1790, as best as current records can indicate, an enterprising innkeeper in Bedgelert, which is a nearby village that actually means the grave of Saint Gelert in its name, hoping to drum up business to his inn, began to promulgate this myth that there was a dog named Gelert that was personally martyred by King Llewellyn, shout out to Llewellyn Publishing House.
No relation, but yes.
Yeah, no relation. But yeah, this dog Gelert was killed by King Llewellyn in the same manner and circumstance as Guinefort, having mistaken the blood of a wolf that had been killed by Gelert in the defense of Llewellyn's only child. So this innkeeper set up a sacred grove, put a raised mound with the grave marker of a dog named Gelert that is inscribed with this particular hagiography right outside the inn. And in the early 1800s, a poem written by W.R. Spencer became incredibly popular as a result of the legend that this guy set up on like a grift. And it became so popular that Joseph Haydn set it to music, and further propagated the idea of this cult of a dog saint Galert.
This is some Saul Goodman shit. I'm sorry. Like,
It really is. And due to the popularity of this legend, the veneration of the two Galerts became completely conflated and are now nearly inseparable, maintaining the same offices that Saint Hilaire had against illness, injury, and the plague.
there you have it, folks. We love a good oral, folktale, and this is a good proof of just how mutable oral lore is. It will change from place to place, and sometimes all it takes is one swindler to make a homonym or a rhyme or something, or just wanting to get more attraction or more money and more pilgrimages. It just there's like 3 heads of Mary Magdalene. There's like all these relics, so
Right.
there's this many versions of Jesus's fingers, into this money-making scheme for more pilgrims. But you also, and sometimes spirits look at that and they're like, I don't care. That's power. There's something going on here. Just people venerating it. I'll do it. So people are like, oh, Saint Cyprian, that image of him is actually Saint Cyprian of Carthage. It's just like, well, wait until you've realized that both, Cyprian of Carthage was born in the utter Antioch, whereas Cyprian of Antioch was martyred in the Antioch of Asia Minor. And then on top of that, who cares? Like the motif something wears that skin and comes like that sometimes in other forms as well, and responds to that name, regardless of the the historicity of the hagiography, and now you're just working with a spirit. So welcome to animism, welcome to spirit work. Things will fill the offices that we make, including statues that are not consecrated. Something else will wear that skin eventually, and we'll start to make it move. So make sure you wash them so that they are only inhabited by what you want, unless you are ready for a Galère, Guinefort type situation to occur. And I love that you brought my attention to Keith Solomon, just kind of bring it back.
Yeah, speaking of filling offices that otherwise would remain unfilled. In the research for this episode, I recalled an excerpt from, the OG, the Key of Solomon, specifically Book 2, Chapter 3, as it's rendered on, Esoteric Archives of the Peterson translation, which is how the companions or disciples of the master of the art ought to regulate and govern themselves.
When the master of the art wishes to put in practice any operation or experiment, especially one of importance, he should first consider of what companions he should avail himself. This is the reason why in every operation whose experience should be carried out in the circle, it is well to have 3 companions. And if he cannot have companions, he should at least have with him a faithful and attached dog. If the master of art wishes to have a dog for his companion, he must bathe him thoroughly with the exercised water in the same manner as the disciples, and let him perfume him with the odors and incense of art, and let him repeat the following conjuration over him. I conjure thee, O thou creature, being a dog by him who hath created thee, I bathe and I perfume thee in the name of the Most High, most powerful and eternal God, so that thou mayest be my true companion in this operation, and that thou mayest be also my faithful friend in whatsoever operation I may hereafter perform.
Yeah, and, this particular consecration always really deeply fascinated me because, of course, I, being a dog guy and being known in certain circles for that, really want a group of, dogs in my life, one of which I consecrate by these exact means and have as my Solomonic buddy.
It's just a good friend.
Yeah. And I think it's one of those things where it's, it doesn't matter the true form of what is going on as long as it's efficacious. Because, of course, the grimoire calls upon you to have 3 priests in the circle. Barring that, 3 random dudes. Barring that, a dude and 2 children who are presumably his. Boy Squire memes aside. And, barring all that, it's like, screw it, get a dog and consecrate as the witness because it'll be fine. It can affect miracles, so go for it.
And you just got to consecrate Miss Guinefort. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
We're going to get a nice greyhound statue for the garden.
That we are.
And we're going to do some funky stuff with it. We're going to create our own little sacred grove. You know that the trees in the backyard, the little area? Yeah, that's where we're going to put them.
Perfect.
And we're going to make our own little Guinefort garden. And we'll see how that goes. So I thank you all for tuning in. I really hope you guys liked learning a little bit about St. Guinefort, and please let us know what kind of magics you'll be getting up to, because I know Key and I have 10,000 ideas, and our ideas combined are probably only half of Salt's. So, and you already have a practice with him. You already have spirits that literally do venerate him, and who are associated with his magics. But I think that if anything, this is just more food for thought about how spirits inhabit different roles and offices that we create, as well as those that are created, even for them and imposed upon their relics and their remains. I think I will forever think to myself what Stephen of Bourbon did with those ashes of the burnt greyhound afterwards, and how his legacy became in some ways haunted by them, because that spirit continues to be in those woods and now continues to be far beyond it. Just as Guinefort the Man's relics went far beyond Italy and came to be syncretized with the dog.
Absolutely. I think it's exactly as you mentioned, as he tried to suppress the cult. He did the classic move of promulgating the existence of the cult, perpetuating its existence even, and ensuring that us in North America can revive his veneration. To this day, I see in icons of Saint Roch and statues of Saint Roch that it's always mentioned that the dog at his feet is Saint Guinefort, ever by his side.
Indeed. And speaking of which, my Akashic record for today is none other than Tired Old Dog by the Devil and the Almighty Blues. One of my favorite bands that you introduced me to. Have listened to it many times, especially Storm Coming Down. But today it's Tired Old Dog. I highly recommend them if you like. It's one of those bands where the name is exactly what it says, like the Devil and the Almighty Blues. That's exactly what you're getting, and it's the music is absolutely great.
Yeah, definitely one of my favorite albums of all time. The self-titled EP from the Devil and the Almighty Blues. So check that out. My Akashic record of the day is a last-minute switch away from what I was going to name it, because I remembered that this song exists and that I actually listened to it when doing some of this research, which is Saint Bernard by Lincoln, off the album A Constant State of Ohio. Which, fun name for the Americans listening.
I know where some of the states are. I know some of them. I've been to some of them. And you have an honorable mention?
I do. So the honorable mention, the vibe is completely off for this episode, being a saintly dog who is known for his protection and healing of children. But if you want to go very hard, like the Solomonic Grimoire of consecrating a dog to bite the throats of demons and help subjugate them with you in the circle, I have Down the Infinite Well by Eustasha.
Yes.
Much as Guinefort was thrown down an infinite well and disinterred and reinterred in the infinite well of his present cults, we have Eustasha's screaming at the top of their head, "Don't play with kids in the room" type
I love it. And I just get those little like Etsy style charms with like greyhounds that you like cut out and put it on your kid's crib. That would be amazing, like protection of the crib, or like the nursery type charm. Oh, I already have there's gonna be a lot. My children are gonna be juiced up, drinking straight from the tap when it comes to the wellspring, if you will, of the sacred well. I am very excited to put some of this stuff to use. Thank you so much for bringing it to my attention, and I'm really glad you and I could do a little dual episode. But next time, Salt Way Back, I'll be on a mission, but I will still be on, so you'll hear my voice still. But I am about to go on a bit of a journey, so I'll be back hopefully soon rather than later. And I'm looking forward to continuing with you all. Thank you all so much for supporting us. Please follow us on twitter.com/frightfulhowls. And if you'd like, consider supporting us on patreon.com/thefrightfulhowls. Every, subscriber counts. Every patron really matters a lot to us. We're so delighted. You get occasional new drops, such as, our Salt giving us our wonderful almanac, for astrology, giving us, timings of things and what to do with them, including, really detailed oral charms and different experiments to do and what not to do on certain days and what to do on others. Also, coming from him, we have occasional bonuses such as a selections for fixed stars and planets and so on. You get access to our Q&As. You get to ask us any questions you like, and we'll answer them on our Patreon. You also get to suggest episode titles and get our wonderful show notes where you can see the research that went into the episode, as well as some of the gags involved. And today, our License Set Apart comes to us from the Key of Solomon Book 1. More Key of Solomon stuff, but it is B Key. It is the braying of hounds key. And he's here to give it to us again. Let us depart into the night, where we may swing babies through trees and call them changelings because they cough the wrong way. and call some French grandmas on the phone. We're gonna do some necromancy, you and I, tonight, just to make sure we gotta locate her. Definitely, who is this woman? And where can I ask her some very pointed questions about elder trees and their lore?
Yeah, who was this woman who was notable enough and expert on elder trees and changelings and nailing illnesses to the above? I want her on the telephone.
Put her on my phone. Text me. All right.
So avoiding addressing this to her, but addressing it to the other spirits that have come to haunt the technological platforms with which we record this podcast, we bring you the OG License to Depart from the Key of Solomon Book 1, where we take the name The License to Depart. So here goes.
Hit it with us.
In the name of Adonai, the eternal and everlasting one, let each of you return unto his place. Be there peace between us and you, and be ye ready to come when you are called. For in the beginning, God created heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw light, and it was good.
Innan fåglarna började sjunga, började hållet freder till fagerungers vän. Hon hade en falskaliger tunga. Hermanelik trollofen i mig, värdet jag bjuder så gärna. I kunden väl svara endast ja eller nej, om I viljen eller ej.